afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's SpaceTime interview hosted by the National Security Association's Moorman Center for Space Studies. I'm Steve Jacques, NSSA's Executive Director, filling in for Mike Tierney, who currently today is a bit under the weather. So I'll be pleased to be moderating today's discussion. And the topic today is homeland missile defense and the concept of a golden dome for America. With the evolving threats from Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, ensuring a robust defense against missile attacks is more critical today than ever. Today, we'll explore the policy, technology, and strategic challenges in building a comprehensive homeland missile defense system. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, you're really in for a treat today to hear from three seasoned professionals who are among our nation's most knowledgeable experts on this very, very important topic. So let me first introduce you to our three esteemed panelists. First, we have Dr. Rob Soofer. Rob is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, adjunct professor at Georgetown University, a former professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee, where his oversight responsibilities included U.S. nuclear forces, missile defense, non-proliferation and arms control policy, and space programs, and is also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, or that would be a DASD, for nuclear and missile defense policy. While in his latter role, Rob co-led the 2019 Missile Defense Review and Nuclear Posture Review. Next, we have Air Force Retired Lieutenant General Trey Obering. Trey Obering is now a Booz Allen Senior Executive Advisor based in Virginia, after serving 13 years as Booz Allen's Executive Vice President and partner. General Obering retired from the Air Force with more than 35 years of experience in the space and defense systems development, integration, and operations. A former F-4E pilot, he was a space shuttle project engineer, both at Vandenberg Air Force Base, Kennedy Space Center, and believe it or not, back to Vandenberg Air Force Base, this over a 7-year period of time, and later served as the Space Launch Division Chief and the Air Force's Acquisition Secretary in the Pentagon. His final Air Force duties had him serving as former Deputy Director and then the Director of the Missile Defense Agency over a 6-year period from 2003 to 2009, when he was the Service Acquisition Executive for the nation's $10 billion a year missile defense program. And last but not least, we have Mr. Chris Williams. As most of you know, Chris is the NSSA's chair of the Moorman Center for Space Studies, also a former acting under Secretary of Defense for Policy under Don Rumsfeld, spent a couple of decades on Capitol Hill, along with them being a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee, carrying a very similar oversight portfolio as Rob Soofer did in the Senate. So in sum, Rob, General Obering, Chris bring their collective deep experience in national security and strategic planning. So now each panelist will provide a 15-minute opening statement, following by a moderated discussion and audience Q&A. For those of you attending, and there are hundreds of you online, we're just delighted to have you all here. Please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A feature at any time. I'll do the best I can to select a few during the Q&A portion of later in this session. So how about we get started with Dr. Soofer. Rob, who will be speaking, will outline the policy and strategic rationale for homeland missile defense. Dr. Soofer, Rob, my good friend of all time, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you, Steve, and to you and Chris. A big thanks for putting on this event. For those of us with gray hairs, especially on the panel, we lived through the debates over the Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative that was launched in the middle 1980s. And I think that we're probably in store for a similar level of debate over the president's Golden Dome concept. And again, for those of you who were there, you remember that there were few debates in the nuclear policy world, and probably in the defense world writ large, that were more passionate than the missile defense debate, and we can talk about the reasons for that. But first, let's perhaps level set where we think the president is going in terms of his Iron Dome or his Golden Dome initiative. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about how we, who just completed a study at the Atlantic Council on homeland missile defense, how we view sort of the problem set, why you need missile defense, right? And then maybe talk a little bit about how we think you should design a missile defense system, and then turn it over to Trey, who has actually designed missile defense systems, for his insights. So with respect to the Iron Dome executive order, a few key points here. The president points out that in terms of the threat, this is the most catastrophic threat facing the United States, and he's referring to the ballistic missiles, the hypersonic glide vehicles, and the cruise missiles. I think both conventionally and nuclear. But clearly, the threat is amply stated, and it seems to be expanding in scope and quality. So, what's the policy for dealing with the threat? Well, we'll probably see a more in-depth explanation of what that policy is in congressional testimony later this year. But according to the executive order, what they want to do is move beyond the current homeland missile defense policy, which, to remind the viewers, is to build missile defenses, that is to stay ahead of the to stay ahead of the ballistic missile threat from rogue countries, such as North Korea and Iran, right? But not to build missile defenses explicitly against Russia and China, but instead to rely on nuclear deterrence. And the president wants to move beyond that to include defenses against all countries and all threats. And if you read the executive order carefully, you'll see that what they may want to do is provide protection for U.S. citizens, for critical infrastructure, and also to protect U.S. Nuclear retaliatory forces, or so-called secure second strike capability. So there's a range of objectives for the system. Again, it's protecting people, it's protecting critical infrastructure, and it's protecting nuclear forces. And it's to protect the homeland against all nations, Russia and China included. When you read the implementation section of the executive order, it's apparent that what they're after here is a layered missile defense system. Today, to defend the homeland, we really have only one layer. It's the ground-based mid-course defense system with its 44 ground-based interceptors deployed in California and Alaska. What this executive order asks the Department of Defense to do is to look at not only the GMD system, which intercepts missiles in the mid-course, but also let's look at boost phase defense, where you can intercept the missile as it's being launched, and look at how you could perhaps build an underlayer to the ground-based mid-course defense system to intercept missiles also in the terminal phase. The key to missile defense is a layered defense. By having a layered defense, you make it easier for each individual layer to intercept the system, to intercept the threat. And whatever can't get through the first or second layer can be intercepted by the third layer, for instance. But also, getting back to the executive order, there's a section in here that talks about cooperation with allies, improving the forward deployed assets that we already deploy abroad, but also to accelerate the provision of missile defense systems to allies. So we are not by any means ignoring the other purpose for missile defense, in addition to homeland defense, regional missile defense, right? When I read this document, I don't think it's mandating an unlimited missile defense system. I don't think it's mandating an Astrodome defense by any means. And we can explain, we can unpack that later on. But with this as a background, let me suggest what I think that the role of missile defense should be in light of three specific problems that we need to address. And if you look at the national defense strategy of the United States, you can't get past the first page without hearing the line, "First, we will defend the homeland." It's essential that we defend the homeland. In fact, defending the homeland is the foundation for all of U.S. strategy. The Secretary of Defense and the President, they have to understand that the homeland is protected if they're going to run risks on behalf of allies and extend forces abroad. So defending the homeland, at the very least, enables all the rest of U.S. national security strategy. That's the key here. Now, there's three specific threats that I think we need to deal with. The first is the expanding threat from North Korea. And as I said before, it is our policy today to stay ahead of that threat. But are we actually staying ahead is the question. There are no official unclassified estimates of how many ICBMs North Korea have. I think it's probably somewhere between 11 and 20 at this point. But the Northcom commander is concerned that we're not staying ahead of the threat. General Guillot said back in 2024, I am concerned that Kim Jong-un's growing ICBM stockpile could approach our capacity to defend North America. In addition to the numbers, North Korea eventually will build multiple warheads on their ballistic missiles, and they will eventually have countermeasures and decoys. The threat is going to increase in number and sophistication, and we will need to do things to stay ahead of that threat. If we don't, our allies are going to start to get very nervous. In fact, they already are. Former Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, was quoted to say, North Korea has put America's mainland within range. Therefore, America must take the risk of a nuclear attack by North Korea into account when making the decision to launch nuclear weapons into North Korea for the sake of Japan. In other words, South Korea, Japan, and other allies are concerned that the United States is increasingly vulnerable to these threats and that we may not be willing to run risks on their behalf. So if our growing vulnerability to these threats is creating this apprehension by our allies, the logic here is that by lessening that vulnerability, we convince our allies that we are willing to run risks on their behalf because we have a measure of protection for the United States. And in so doing, we convince our adversaries, again, that we are willing to run these risks and convince them that they cannot coerce us or blackmail us by making these nuclear threats. So that's the first problem set that requires a solution. The second has to deal specifically with Russia and China. And there's two parts of this problem. The first one is we notice that Russia and China are developing capabilities and a doctrine to strike the United States, not with a large-scale nuclear attack to destroy our cities and society, but limited strikes against our critical infrastructure and other key targets to either prevent us from reinforcing our allies or to break our will. In fact, this was the phrase that former Army Secretary Christine Wormuth used. She said that China is building the capability to strike the United States to break our will, to keep us from reinforcing our allies. This was a problem identified by the bipartisan, congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission, where they said that limited coercive attacks, referring to those attacks from Russia and China, are potentially designed to dissuade and deter the United States from defending or supporting its allies and partners in a regional conflict, to keep the United States from participating in any confrontation, and to divide U.S. alliances. If this is truly a problem, and I believe it is, witness the fact that China is actually developing a conventionally armed ICBM, specifically to attack the United States. If this is a problem, then there should be a role for missile defense in taking away this limited nuclear strike threat from Russia and China. And we can unpack that as well. But there is a role for missile defense, and it's not it doesn't have to be a thick, comprehensive defense, just enough defense to create uncertainty in the mind of the Russian and the Chinese attack planner that these limited strikes will fail. The final problem set is, that China is expanding its nuclear forces. And one of the key questions that we have today as a nation is how are we now going to deter two major nuclear powers? Again, according to the Strategic Posture Commission, they point out that we need to address the possibility that China will field large-scale counter-force capable missile forces that pose a threat to U.S. strategic nuclear forces on par with the threat Russia poses to those forces today. So now, if we have a deterrent that can survive a Russian nuclear threat, the question is, do we have enough nuclear forces and survivable forces to be able to endure an attack against one major nuclear power and still be able to deter the other? And so the question becomes, is there a role for missile defense? Again, preferential missile defense for U.S. nuclear forces, such as ICBM fields, bomber bases, submarines, nuclear command and control. Is there a role there for taking away this possible or combined Russian and Chinese, or even sequential major attack against U.S. nuclear forces? And I believe there is. So now, for the sake of time, I just want to point out that, again, the purpose of our missile defenses is not to provide an Astrodome defense, a leak-proof defense for the United States, but to create enough uncertainty in the mind of the Russian, Chinese, North Korean attack planner that they can't contemplate any strategic value for attacking the United States. If you keep that sort of a criteria in mind, this could drive your defense design. And again, you don't need a comprehensive defense. You don't need to protect every city. You don't need to protect all of our civilians. You just need enough missile defense to deny the objective of these attacks. And so your design has to be a layered defense. You have to have boost phase, mid-course, terminal. You have to have ground-based systems, space-based systems, and you need to figure out some way to integrate all this together. And so let me say the last thing before I turn it over is there's a few ways that you can approach this, and I think the executive order will probably tease all of these out. So today, if the Trump administration wants to address at least a North Korean threat, the only thing they can do is add an underlayer to the ground-based mid-course defense system, which means deploying more SM-32A missiles and THAAD missiles either on ships or on U.S. territory to bolster the ground-based interceptor system. That's sort of the near-term approach. The longer-term approach to move to the next generation of missile defense systems, you have to go to space with space-based sensors, space-based interceptors, and boost phase defense, which I think is something that I'll leave for Trey to discuss. But in the politics of missile defense, the big question is how much is this going to cost, and can we actually afford it? And the last thing I want to say is to remind the viewers that today we spend 1/3 of 1% of the defense budget on homeland missile defense. 1/3 of 1% of the DoD budget on homeland defense. If you would just increase that amount to say 1% of the defense budget for homeland defense, you could add another $5 or $6 billion a year, which I think would take you a long way to achieving the capabilities that I've discussed and that I think Trey will complement us with. So with that, I'll turn it over to General Obering, please.
Hey, Rob, thanks very much for those insights. Very enlightening. Really do appreciate that. So now we turn over to General Obering, who will discuss the technological advances and system integration challenges associated with missile defense. So General Obering, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. And I very much am an honor to be here to talk about this today. As Rob said, and I'll reinforce a couple of things that he said, I think one of the reasons why President Trump issued his executive order is he's seen what's happened, not only recently, but over the past several years in terms of what's happened with missile attacks around the world. And what we're seeing is nations are really relying heavily on ballistic missiles and drones to become their air force of choice. And of course, we've seen what's happened both in Russia and Ukraine, where there have been hundreds of missiles fired there, including hypersonic capable missiles. And of course, Hamas and Hezbollah have been firing hundreds and hundreds of rockets and missiles into Israel in the latest war. Now, as Rob mentioned, the current missile defense system we have, and I want to take a pause here because I think this is a really important point. This whole concept of Iron Dome and the executive order is going to generate a whole nother debate about, do we need missile defense? How much missile defense do we need? And looking forward to try to characterize and quantify that. If we go backwards, and if I go back when I was the director of Missile Defense Agency, we were having religious fights on the Hill and elsewhere about missile defense back then. And we were able to field and deploy an integrated missile defense system that was clearly designed against the North Korean threat or Iranian threat in terms of homeland defense. But we designed also missiles that were missile defense interceptors that we've deployed all over the world globally, to include the PAC-3, the THAAD, the SM-3, et cetera. And I would remind everyone that a lot of the protection that you have seen in the Middle East in terms of the protection of the attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea and other places around the globe, we've relied on those missiles. We've relied on PAC-3 in combat now. We've relied on SM-3 in combat. We've relied on THAAD in combat. And so we would not have had that capability had we not won that debate, that religious debate back in the early 2000s. And so as as Rob said, our current homeland defense is clearly designed for limited attack from North Korea or Iran, and that involves relatively small missile threats and raid sizes, simple countermeasures and decoys, and designed for non-maneuvering threats. We do not have what we call birth-to-death tracking because we are primarily relying on terrestrially based radars, both land and sea-based radars, to do that. The only thing we do today from space is basically provide a warning and a wake-up track for the system. We do not have the ability for an operational precision tracking from space, which means that we would be able to take a track from our orbit satellite and to use that to actually engage a threat warhead. We've actually demonstrated that capability back in the 2009, 2010 with the launch of our STSS system. We launched 2 demonstration satellites, and we did in fact use them in our coverage, in our flight test, I'm sorry, in terms of being able to engage on that track from space. And the other thing, as Rob mentioned, we do not have any boost or ascent phase coverage for countries, especially like Russia or China, because of the geography and the timing that would be required. Now, what all this does is, Rob said, if I was asked now today to try to design what this Golden Dome architecture would look like, and as the president called for a space-based element, we would have to, in fact, go to space to be able to answer a lot of the challenges that we've talked about. And just like the Strategic Defense Initiative Office did back in the 1980s, they immediately turned to space because they realized the challenge that they were facing. And now, also, as Rob said, we need, I think, going forward from a strategic consideration, we need the capability and capacity to defeat anything and everything that could be thrown at us from North Korea or Iran. With respect to Russia and China, we need to have the capability to defeat anything they can throw, whether that be hypersonic, fractional orbital bombardment, you name it, and enough capacity to make sure that we have maintained our strategic deterrence. And it also brings up another key point that's changed from the past, which was, in the past, missile defense was always viewed as in conflict with strategic deterrence. It was destabilizing, it was upsetting. When in fact, what we discovered going all the way back to 2006, when the North Koreans first launched their Taebalong-2, we realize now that missile defense is actually a stabilizing factor and actually works in consonance with strategic deterrence. So if I'm to try to take a look at how would I organize this architecture, we have to go to space. But what we have to do is inject a lot of the technology that has been developed since we first began this journey back in the 1980s in terms of space-based missile defense. So there was a concept back then called Brilliant Pebbles. It was a 1,000 satellite constellation that the SDIO office was looking to put into orbit. Since that time, and if you think about the time frame that they were doing that, we had no internet, we had no artificial intelligence, we had no peer-to-peer communications, we had none of the processing, not even close to the processing power we have today. So the technology is now allowing us to build cost-effective space-based missile defenses. And just one concept I'll walk through and just very, very briefly is the fact that we could put enough interceptors on orbit to actually put a question in the mind of the attacker as to whether or not they would be successful, including a boost ascent phase capability. Now, what might this look like? Well, one thing that some of our folks at Booz Allen have taken a look at over the past several years is exactly what this would look like in terms of taking a Brilliant Pebbles type of concept and infusing modern technology into that. So what we envision would be a large resilient constellation of highly maneuverable small satellites that would rely on peer-to-peer networks, such as that would be capable in LEO, such as Starlink, Starshield, even SDA's transport layer, and that they would be infused with artificial intelligence, machine learning, that they could autonomously determine which is the target, who's going to take the target, et cetera. And to very, very oversimplify this, it is almost like putting an Uber network in space in which the threat warhead would be a passenger to be picked up and the individual interceptors, these satellites, would be the drivers to go pick them up. And before we think that that's far-fetched, a version of this was actually done in Ukraine, where an enterprising Ukrainian artillery officer built a system called GIS ARDA. And basically it was just that. It was an Uber system which leveraged Starlink. And he downloaded apps, the citizens downloaded apps on their phones. And if they saw a Russian tank, they could take a live video, and basically they could put an artillery shell or a javelin a missile on that tank in a matter of minutes, which is exactly the type of concept we would have going forward. Now, to drill down a little bit more in this architecture, what we looked at was anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 of these satellites in 20 orbital planes, with 50 to 100 of these satellites per plane in sun-synchronous orbit. And what that allows us to do is we get multiple attempts at intercept, and including the ability to achieve an intercept in that critical first boost ascent phase of flight, where the threat missile is the most vulnerable. It's either in a boost condition, or it's just released a post-boost vehicle with warheads and decoys, et cetera, on that. And the beauty of being able to intercept in that phase is that you are basically taking out that entire vehicle before it gets a chance to release multiple warheads, and therefore compound your defense problem or countermeasures and decoys as well. And like I said, this would incorporate a lot of the technology that you're using every day in your phone, to include, as I said, AI, ML, peer-to-peer mesh networks, blockchain, et cetera. The other thing that would allow this, because this concept has been looked at periodically in the recent years, and it always came back, well, this would be too expensive, or this is not doable because of that, because of the hundreds of thousands of interceptors it would require and the cost associated with it. And I don't think what these studies really looked at, though, were the dramatic reductions that we've had in things like manufacturing costs, the increases in computer processing and sensor capability, the major reduction in space launch costs that is now available to us. And in fact, if you think about it, if you just look at the Starlink constellation today, there are over 7,000 satellites in orbit. And the development and launch cost of that have been advertised to be less than $15 billion. That makes it very competitive with being able to put a reasonably affordable capability into space. And of course, I began the deployment of the GMD system. It was very critical for us to be able to do that, to protect this nation against the North Korean threat. That system, with all of the interceptors we deployed, with the radars we modified globally, it cost about $30 billion, $35 billion to deploy that system. But we ended up with 44 interceptors, 40 in Alaska, 4 in California. For roughly the same amount of money, we should be able to put up 1,000 to 2,000, actually 2,000 interceptors in orbit to be able to defend in a much more robust fashion against an increasing threat from both Russia and China. It is not to be the end all to be all. This is not a silver bullet that's going to accomplish everything, but it certainly would be a key element of, I think, any of the architectures going forward in the Golden Dome era. So with that, I'll stop now and turn it over back to you, Steve.
Let's see, come back. Well, back there I am. Thanks, Trey. Really appreciate that perspective. The technology is key to the discussion, no doubt about that. Now we are happy to turn over to Chris Williams, who will provide the insights into the broader strategic and policy implications of homeland missile defense. Chris, over to you, sir.
Thanks very much. And let me first say what an honor and privilege it is to be on a panel with these two very distinguished gentlemen. It's been a great pleasure of mine to have worked with both, and as well as numerous prior SDIO directors going back to the days of another national hero, Jim Abramson. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to address in fairly short order some of the key issues that Secretary Hegseth and others in the department must address in order to implement the letter and the spirit of the President's January 27th Executive Order, or EO. The first issue is requirements. The EO calls for quote unquote capabilities-based requirements for the overarching system to be issued within 60 days of the publication of the EO. Whether they'll meet that timeline is a separate question. But on the substance of requirements, who will set those requirements for the individual elements, including space systems, of the overarching system? How will those requirements flow down across an integrated Golden Dome architecture? How will the proposed requirements correspond with the 2-year epochs that are referenced in the executive order? And how will the requirements process take into account the urgency of the mission? When we refer to these epochs, as many of you are aware, in the executive order itself and subsequent guidance that came out from the department, there are 2-year epochs beginning this year and extending into future years that are supposed to define what can be fielded and other activities and timelines, deadlines in each of those epochs. If you haven't seen those, you should take a look at them, because it obviously puts a primacy on fielding capabilities as quickly and urgently as possible. The second issue has to do with operational roles, missions, and cultures. What are the roles and missions of the key DoD organizations involved in operating the proposed integrated air and missile defense system? For example, how will U.S. NORTHCOM, U.S. SpaceCom, and other regional and functional commands coordinate to assure seamless data sharing and timely, effective defensive operations? This is always a challenge. Cross-command communications, integration, collaboration is greatly desired on multiple fronts, but not always easy to accomplish. I would reference a comment by General Mike Gutlein, who is the Vice Chief of Space Operations. A recent comment from him. He said, quote, "The only thing I can think of in the history of the United States where we have gone after something this complex was the Manhattan Project. It's not complex because the technology is going to be hard. It's complex because of the number of organizations and the number of agencies that need to be involved. Organizational behavior and culture are going to be 2 biggest challenges," end quote. I think he's right there. The organizational issues and roles and missions aspects across the operational community are going to be very significant. So how will the department choose to address these roles and missions and culture issues? How they will do that will likely determine the timelines for and effectiveness of the Golden Dome system of systems. And then another issue is organizational construct. Along these same lines, the EO calls upon the Secretary of Defense to, quote, "review relevant authorities and organization of the Department of Defense to develop and deploy capabilities at the necessary speed to implement this directive," end quote. Are new statutory or other authorities needed? Is a reorganization in the works to further emphasize the importance of homeland defense? If so, what might that reorg look like? And will any such reorganization help enable the rapid development of much needed capabilities, or will it divert time, resources, and attention away from fielding critical systems? Next set of issues include acquisition. Numerous organizations will be responsible for acquiring the various elements of the Golden Dome system of systems. This will likely include the Missile Defense Agency, the U.S. Space Force, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, and other DoD acquisition organizations. How will the DoD acquisition process ensure that the best systems and technologies are developed and fielded, and that they will be interoperable? Which systems should be accorded the highest priority and hence lay claim to the most resources? And which organizations will have primary responsibility for architecting and integrating the overarching system of systems? Lastly, are additional or streamlined acquisition authorities needed to ensure rapid and successful development and fielding of the Homeland Defense System? There are a number of streamlined acquisition approaches that the department leverages, authorities that the department leverages. Which of those will they choose and why? And again, is the department looking to change organizational responsibilities and seek new authorities? If so, they may get the Congress to approve those, and what would the timeline be for achieving those changes? Another issue has to do with concepts of operation, rules of engagement, and tactics, techniques, and procedures. One must assume that adversaries will seek to counter U.S. ground, air, and space-based sensors and defensive systems through a variety of means and methods. For example, China and Russia are rapidly fielding a wide range of counter-space systems, including kinetic kill systems, jammers, lasers, cyber attacks, and more. And certain adversaries are developing hypersonic and fractional orbital bombardment systems that severely challenge U.S. sensor networks. U.S. military operators will need clear and actionable concepts of operation, rules of engagement, and tactics, techniques, and procedures to guide their air and missile defense planning, exercises, and operations, as well as ensure consistency with broader departmental and national policy and strategy guidance. An additional issue is classification and security, a thorny but perennial favorite in some of these areas. Certain military systems are highly classified in order to protect sensitive technologies and capabilities. This includes some critical national security space systems. Efforts to reduce the classification of such systems and capabilities in order to better integrate them into U.S. military plans, exercises, and signaling for deterrence have met with only limited success. In this regard, the Trump administration must decide whether to keep some or all space-based missile defense capabilities under wraps, or instead to reveal more information about such capabilities in order to enhance deterrence of attacks and promote operational effectiveness. Will the Trump administration finally solve this thorny problem? An obvious additional issue is funding. Because the department has yet to determine which systems it will be acquiring, a realistic cost estimate for the Golden Dome system does not yet exist. Suffice it to say that current budgets will not be sufficient to rapidly develop, test, and field the requisite Golden Dome capabilities. Will the president agree to a significant increase in the defense top-line budget, or instead will funds be taken from other lower priority DoD programs and activities? How will the Congress's difficulties in passing annual appropriations bills for the Department of Defense impact the ability to rapidly deliver a Golden Dome system? Will funds for implementing the Golden Dome system be included in a possible reconciliation package now under consideration by lawmakers? How will operating under a series of continuing resolutions impact the department's ability to rapidly develop, deploy, and integrate the Golden Dome for America? Some measure of predictability in budgeting and planning is needed for a program as important and as complex as Golden Dome. Right now, we don't seem to have that predictability. I'd also raise with you supply chain gaps. Even assuming adequate funding is provided, the department will need to address acknowledged shortfalls and challenges in key supply chains. Gaps for U.S. national security space systems, for example, include propulsion systems, hardened electronics, laser crosslinks, among other systems and technologies. According to the Government Accountability Office and others, these and other supply chain challenges have already delayed a variety of critical DoD space programs, including systems being developed by the Space Development Agency and other organizations. The president's executive order makes note of supply chain issues when it calls for, quote, development and deployment of a secure supply chain for all components with next generation security and resilience features, end quote. Does the department have a credible plan to address these gaps on a rapid timeline? We also need to consider the role of America's friends and allies in the Golden Dome for America. While some homeland defense missions can be conducted exclusively by the United States, for many such missions, we will rely on support provided by various friends and allies across the globe. For example, our NORAD, or North American Aerospace Defense Command, partners in Canada contribute mightily to the air and missile defense of our nation and hemisphere. In this regard, the department should develop a strategy for maximizing and leveraging the contributions of various friends and allies as part of the Golden Dome for America framework. And let me turn to space systems in particular. As some of you may have seen, yesterday, Secretary of Defense Hegseth said the following about space, quote, "There's no way to ignore the fact that the next and the most important domain of warfare will be the space domain. So you're going to see far more investment from this administration into that domain, both offensively and defensively, because that's where we can continue to maintain an advantage. There are strategic things that can be done that change the entire warfighting calculus that no one else is paying attention to, and I would anticipate that the space domain is one of those for us," end quote. Secretary Hegseth is right, of course, on this topic. President Trump's executive order makes clear that space systems will play a pivotal role in the Golden Dome Homeland Defense System, as well as with allied and theater missile defense capabilities. For example, the president directed that the reference architecture called for in the EO shall include acceleration of the deployment of the hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor layer, and development and deployment of a custody layer of the proliferated warfighter space architecture. It also directed development and deployment of non-kinetic capabilities to augment the kinetic defeat of ballistic, hypersonic, advanced cruise missiles, and other next-generation aerial attacks. In this regard, leveraging space systems for a variety of purposes, ranging from intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, missile warning and tracking, communications, air and missile defense, and more makes great sense. Obviously, a key issue that must be addressed is the future of the Space Development Agency, which is responsible for acquisition of several key programs explicitly referenced in the EO. The recent departure of SDA's talented director, Dr. Derek Tournier, leaves a gaping hole in that organization. And likewise, the ongoing investigation into alleged contracting improprieties must be promptly completed and any remedial measures promptly implemented in order to allow key SDA programs to proceed apace, given their critical importance to the nation's defense. And lastly, I'd turn to space-based weapons. Long-standing political and ideological disagreements exist over weapons in space in general, and development and deployment of space-based missile defenses in particular. For those like me, old enough to remember, President Reagan's March 23, 1983 speech calling for active defenses against Soviet ballistic missiles produced many heated domestic and international debates, as well as legislative action in the Congress to reduce funding for such systems, the issuance of testing prohibitions, and more. Yet history reveals that the Strategic Defense Initiative program helped the U.S. and our friends and allies win the Cold War. Leveraging America's technological strength for defense undermined Soviet military power and brought the Soviet Union to the bargaining table and eventually to its knees. Many current U.S. space capabilities, especially systems for space control and ballistic missile defense, can trace their lineage to Reagan-era SDI investments in critical advanced technologies, just as Trey Obering said. Fast forward to today, and the fielding of offensive and defensive space control systems has seemingly gained more traction in the Congress in a bipartisan fashion. Whether such support will extend to, quote, the development and deployment of proliferated space-based interceptors capable of boost phase intercept, unquote, as explicitly called for in the president's executive order, remains to be seen. Space-based interceptors, including those with boost phase intercept capability, are an essential element in being able to deter and defeat enemy attacks on the homeland, as well as U.S. and allied military forces across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Positioned in low Earth orbit to intercept incoming ballistic missiles during their most vulnerable boost phase, SBIs offer continuous global capability to destroy missiles before they can deploy countermeasures and reach their targets, providing a vital layer of protection against limited missile attacks by engaging threats early in their flight path, just as Trey mentioned earlier. Some contend that the cost of space-based interceptors could be prohibitive. This is false. The miniaturization of key space system components has dramatically reduced the size and weight of potential SBI designs while improving their performance. Investments by the Missile Defense Agency and the U.S. Space Force in advanced kill vehicle technologies have reduced the technical risk and production cost of such systems. Equally important, as Trey mentioned before, the advent of low-cost launch significantly reduces the anticipated cost of rapidly deploying a modestly sized but effective SBI constellation. Detailed analysis will determine the specific technical and performance characteristics of a proposed SBI constellation. However, one can reasonably estimate that a constellation of about 1,500 to 2,000 SBIs will be needed to provide continuous global coverage. For perspective, today's SpaceX Starlink communication satellite constellation includes, as Trey noted, approximately 7,000 satellites, and press reports indicate it could grow to as many as 40,000 satellites within a few years. Critics assert that space-based missile defenses would have little to no value given that adversaries can structure their attacks on the U.S. homeland in a way that reduces the effectiveness of SBIs. This misses the point that an integrated missile defense architecture, which includes space and ground-based interceptors, makes it vastly more difficult for adversaries to negate the effectiveness of the overarching U.S. homeland defense system. Adversaries will confront far greater uncertainty that their attack plans will succeed, which in turn bolsters deterrence of an attack in the first place. Space-based defenses need not be perfect in order to contribute meaningfully to deterrence and warfighting. The key point is this: one should fully expect a renewed campaign of opposition to various elements of Golden Dome, including and especially space-based defensive weapons, from both domestic and international critics. The Department of Defense, supporters in Congress, and the Trump administration more broadly must be ready to effectively counter such criticisms and shape the debate in support of rapidly fielding capabilities necessary to protect the homeland, including space-based defenses. Thanks again to my esteemed colleagues on this panel and to our audience for joining us today. I look forward to your questions. And Steve, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. Let's see. So let's see, gents, why don't you turn your cameras back on? We'll have a little bit of a roundtable series of questions and whatnot. And to the audience, keep the cards and letters coming. We have a handful coming our way. Some of them are very similar, so I'll try to do my best to kind of bundle some of these questions. But first, before we get into that, I do have a specific question for you, Rob, and that deals with your Atlantic Council report that describes the U.S. missile defense policy today as, quote, incoherent. Could you unpack some of that, please?
Right. Well, let me give you one specific example. So we say that we will not defend against Russian and Chinese ballistic missiles, right? Instead, rely on nuclear deterrence. But it is consistent with U.S. policy to actually defend against Russian and Chinese cruise missile threats. These are cruise missiles that can be launched from long-range bomber aircraft as well as submarines. So the problem is, and Northcom has been calling for such defenses for a long time. The problem is that we haven't been willing to spend the money to build those defenses. But what's incoherent is why would you allow, why are defenses against Russian and Chinese cruise missile threats okay, but not defenses against Russian and Chinese ballistic missiles? That's one particular example.
Gotcha. Any other comments from Trey or Chris by chance on that particular topic?
I agree with him.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Rob. A number of questions centering around roles and missions, as you may guess. So why don't we hit some of the little softballs here, centering around who should be in charge of Golden Dome. As one person offered it, the old adage stands that when if everyone's in charge, no one's in charge, as the saying goes. How would you opine on who should be the lead organization, agency, et cetera?
So let me chime in on that, Steve, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Let's go back in history and take a look. What have we done before? When you had a challenge like this, you typically stand up an organization, and in this case already has presidential backing, and you give them some special authorities that, again, we've done many times in our past. We've done it during the Manhattan Project. We did it when we're developing ICBMs. We've done it even around stealth technology. And so what I would envision is that you would put together what I would call a national team of national teams. And that I'm not being facetious. It's going to take that kind of an effort. In this case, if you look at, okay, which agency has actually done this before? Which agency has fielded integrated layered missile defense systems? Which agency has proven that it can develop the technology required for those systems? Which agency has actually shot down a non-productive satellite in orbit? And of course, that's the Missile Defense Agency. Now, could they do it in the instantiation they have today? No, because a lot of the authorities that I enjoyed back when I was a director in the early 2000s have been eroded from that agency. And it's going to have to be elevated, I believe, in the Pentagon, and it's going to have to be given, return some of those authorities. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the building, there are three major authority channels in that building that center around requirements, acquisition, and budget authorities. In addition to policy, but in terms of actually getting programs out the door, I'll put that one aside. And so what needs to happen is we need to reauthorize the director of this team, and if it's the Missile Defense Agency director, to have requirements trade authority like I had in conjunction with the COCOMs. I had budget authority and I had acquisition authority as the head of the contracting authority, as well as the acquisition executive for missile defense. And in addition to that, I used one color of money So I was able to move money around, and I used a very simplified program element structure so that we could move money without having to get reprogramming authority. Those are the kind of things that allow us to get capability out the door. And like I said, it's been done before. And so we have a precedent for it. It's just a matter of the will to do that again.
And Steve, the will begins with the Secretary of Defense. I mean, you know, I was there when Donald Rumsfeld gave the order, and there was support in the White House, right, to withdraw from the ABM treaty and begin deploying a ground-based mid-course defense system. We got out of the treaty in 2002, and by the end of 2004, we had the initial ground-based interceptors into place. Is that kind of a political will from the President and the Secretary of Defense that can make all of this happen?
And I'll just add one thing to Rob's statement. That's exactly right. I had that. I enjoyed that backing from Secretary Rumsfeld. This cannot be done only by the Missile Defense Agency. It will have to be a team of teams, as I said, to include major elements of the Space Force, SDA, SSC, et cetera, along with all aspects, many aspects of the intel community and support. This is truly going to be a national effort.
Thank you. Chris, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think they covered it. I just foot stomped the point that Rob made, which is elaborate on what Rob said, which is, to the best of my knowledge, this is the one program that the president has opined on and put his signature on a piece of paper saying, this is my priority. This is my top priority. And therefore, you know, one should assume that he means it. And therefore, the department needs to act accordingly by giving this the priority it deserves. It's hard to do when there, at present, are, I believe, 3 confirmed officials in the department: the Secretary, the Deputy, and the Secretary of the Army. Maybe 1 or 2 more have been confirmed in the last day or 2. It's hard to do that with interim officials in key positions. But the president set very tight timelines and goals in this executive order, and it really behooves the Secretary, the new Deputy, and others to corral the team inside the department to make sure that they meet those deadlines or come as close to them as they possibly can, and ride herd over what otherwise can be a recalcitrant bureaucracy and organizations that are primarily looking out for themselves rather than the broader national departmental goals and objectives. This should not devolve into just a battle over total obligation authority and, you know, how much budget goes to which organization. It's how do you field capabilities quickly and effectively to protect the nation.
Thank you. Sort of related is tied with the question that centers around the stuff that's going on in MDA today, the stuff that's going on in the Space Development Agency today, the scope of activity that's underway today, as well as Space Force. What additional capabilities do you all see that would be needed in addition to the scope that's being done by at least those 3 large organizations today?
Trey, what's your take on that?
Well, I would say, like I mentioned, if you look at the overall executive order for Golden Dome, that includes left of launch, for example, non-kinetic actions. That will be something that will have to be done not just by the Missile Defense Agency itself, but other organizations, to even include, like I said, some of our IC community that would be able to be involved in that. And then let's get into hypersonic defense, which we haven't really talked that much about, which is part of the executive order, or advanced cruise missile. Now you're going to have much more service involvement and service representation in the solution. We were able to orchestrate that at MDA because the capabilities we developed like that and Patriot were with the Army, the radars that we modified were with the Air Force, and of course the sea-based missiles with the Navy. So there's ways to orchestrate that across the department, but we've done it before and we can do it again. And it's just going to be on a little broader scale than we've done it before.
Gotcha. Any other comments?
I would offer one, going back to the first question. Trey made the very important point that the intelligence community needs to be involved in this, not only from their traditional analytic standpoint of providing timely and insightful analysis of foreign air and missile threats, for example, but also more on under the special authorities the president has and the CIA director have for covert action, disinformation, other activities. There are ways that we as a nation have successfully prosecuted covert action programs that slow or degrade foreign military systems, for example, et cetera. This needs to be a whole of government activity. Most of the action obviously is within the Department of Defense on this, but there's room for diplomacy, there's room for the intelligence community, economic measures that could potentially slow the flow of resources into foreign threat programs, et cetera. So we need to view this as a comprehensive strategy.
And one other thing I'd add, Steve, we haven't talked about this very much, is about timing and what can we do in the near term, the midterm, and the longer term. And in the near term, obviously, we need to take a hard look at what have we deployed, what can be done to dramatically improve some of the capabilities we've deployed as a first step in this, which involves a lot of the current organizations that we already have in play.
Gotcha.
I thought, can I just add briefly to that?
Sure.
The department's guidance on the 2-year epics, I think, is very important in that regard. It helps focus the mind a little bit on what can you do quickly as opposed to a longer term R&D kind of activity. What can be fielded quickly and how do you get those capabilities as rapidly as possible? What are the authorities you need to get those in the field, et cetera, accelerating acquisition authorities, acquisition timelines, et cetera. So the epics are very important. It's not clear to me that there's a strategy to go along with the epics yet in order to deliver capabilities rapidly, but I like the use of epics to characterize the rapid timelines for delivering capabilities.
Hey, Chris, if you want to pursue capability in the first epoch, I think the only thing you can do really is to add more SM-3 2As and THAADs to the architecture. And if viewers think otherwise, I'd like to hear that. But look, at the end of the Trump administration, the Missile Defense Agency successfully tested an Aegis SM-3 2A missile off of an Aegis cruiser against a mock North Korean ICBM. It showed that we could do this in 2020. And by the end of the administration, the Defense Agency had laid in about $3.5 billion over 5 years to begin the integration of the SM-3 2A and the THAAD with the sensors and the GMD fire control system. You could literally dust that off and you're ready to start deploying. Right now, we build about 12 SM-3 2A missiles a year, right? About 12 THAAD missiles a year. This is funding limited. We could probably double or triple that without asking industry to build more factories. And we can start deploying SM-3 2As and THAADs within the first couple of years.
Gotcha. How about in the category of deterrence? What concerns might we have with respect to the risks of a Golden Dome layered defense system potentially undermining that deterrence and increasing potentially the risk of
Steve, you're breaking up.
We should have everybody muted. Okay, I think we're okay now. Sorry, let me try it again. What really are the risks of a Golden Dome layered missile defense system potentially undermining deterrence or increasing the risk of calculations by our near-peer adversaries like China and Russia?
Maybe I could start. When it comes to so-called deterrence stability or strategic stability, there's usually two facets of that. One is like during a crisis situation, are there incentives for one side to use nuclear weapons first because they're afraid if they don't go first, right, they'll suffer undue consequences. And the second element of this is arms racing stability, right? If you deploy defenses with the other side, deploy more offenses, and would you have an action-reaction arms race? Well, with respect to the first thing, which sometimes is referred to as first strike stability or crisis stability, look, by having missile defenses, we assume that we're going to have missile defenses and the Russians and the Chinese will have their own missile defenses. In fact, they're already working on mid-course defense systems. Look, if everybody has missile defenses and you're in a crisis situation, there is no benefit from going first because the other side has missile defenses. So it's a false argument. With respect to the action-reaction arms race argument, I would only point out that the action-reaction theory is just that. It's a theory. If you go back and you look at what's happened In fact, the whole idea behind the 1972 ABM Treaty was that if we limited defenses, both sides would limit the growth of their offensive nuclear capabilities. Well, that didn't turn out to be the case. Russia, the Soviets, and the United States both doubled or even tripled the number of nuclear warheads in their arsenals after the ABM Treaty was signed. Fast forward to 2002, the Bush administration was about to pull out of the ABM Treaty, to withdraw from the treaty, and the arms control community said, no, you can't do that. If you do that, you're going to create this arms race, right? Russia is going to build more weapons, and it'll be the end of arms control. Well, the very same month that we pulled out of the ABM Treaty, we also got agreement with the Russians on the Moscow Treaty, which was to reduce U.S. nuclear forces from 6,000 under START to the Moscow limits of 2,200. Nuclear weapons went down after we pulled out of the ABM Treaty. So this is a very complicated issue, and it's not clear how the Russians and Chinese will react. We know they won't like it, but whether or not this is going to lead to an arms race has yet to be determined. And I think that there's probably a way to manage this deployment over time.
Hey, can I chime in on that, Steve, if you don't mind?
Sure.
The first lesson that we learned in the 90s, in my opinion, is that even when you're the only superpower in the world, as we ostensibly were, you're always in an arms race. We saw China, what happened over the 90s, in the early 2000s, what the Russians have done. We will always be in an arms race, whether we realize it or not. And the other thing about destabilization, I'll go back to a real world experience in 2006. The North Koreans were stacking the Taebanon-2 on the launch site. We were watching them. They were very, very secretive about what they were doing, and in terms of not releasing any information about clearance areas for maritime or aviation corridors, anything like that. We didn't know if it was an ICBM or whether it was going to be a space launch, and whether it would, in fact, threaten Hawaii or parts of Alaska or the West Coast. And there were people calling for us to go and attack the launch site, to preemptively attack that launch site, to make sure we could defend the United States. Now, back then at the time, the White House decided no, they would rely on a ground-based mid-course system if, in fact, that was to that happened, where it posed a threat, as opposed to attacking that site. And I would pose to the audience, which one do you think is more destabilizing? Have the ability to shoot down a missile like that, or going ahead and attacking the launch site from where it was stationed?
If I could add some comments as well on this question of what's stabilizing, what's not. In my view, not having even modest defenses is extraordinarily destabilizing for the United States. In fact, it probably could border on inviting or incentivizing attacks on the homeland, and not necessarily, throw everything you have over the poles at the United States, but very stylized and very specific attacks that are aimed at things like decapitating U.S. political and military leadership. If we have zero ability to defend against those kinds of attacks, or very limited ability, limited effectiveness for defending against those kinds of attacks, it largely invites those kinds of attacks on us. And the implications of that would be severe. Were the Russians or the Chinese to be able to decapitate U.S. leadership, that is the president and or the Secretary of Defense, other senior military officials, et cetera, that could significantly inhibit our ability to prosecute military campaigns, and frankly bring us to our knees in many respects. If we don't have senior leadership to guide the country and guide our military operations, a lot of bad things could happen. So having even modest defenses enhances stability by diminishing the value of certain kinds of attacks on the United States. And that's what we ought to be shooting for. And I think the president and secretary and others, key folks on Capitol Hill, recognize that abject vulnerability is certainly not an effective policy in that regard.
Well, picking up on Congress, what role do we think Congress should play in advancing missile defense, and what are the funding prospects?
Well, Steve, I think we all agree Congress should support homeland missile defenses. That's the role they should play, but that's not going to happen, right? So during the Cold War, passionate debates between principally Republicans and Democrats over the need for deploying homeland missile defenses. after the ABM treaty was in place, those who oppose missile defense were doing it also to support the ABM treaty and keep that from falling apart. So, having said that, at the end of the Cold War, this debate sort of subsided a bit. Republicans and Democrats agree that, all right, well, let's at least build missile defenses against the limited strikes that can be posed by North Korea and the like. And so there was some sense of compromise, but I think we're still at a point where, to the extent there is a compromise, it's a thin compromise once you start adding this thicker defense against Russia and China. So let me give you an example. The legislation from Congress since the end of the Cold War has really influenced the way we think about missile defense, starting with the 1991 Missile Defense Act and the 1999 Missile Defense Act that said it was U.S. policy to build a missile defense system against limited strikes from North Korea, as well as accidental and unauthorized launches, right? And so Congress, primarily the Republicans, have been trying to broaden that definition, to move it away from just limited threats to broader threats. And so in FY 2024, the NDAA changed that law to say that it's the policy of the U.S. to deploy systems that provide effective, layered missile defense capabilities to defeat increasingly complex missile threats in all phases of flight, right? Essentially removing the word limited. But I'm not sure Congress was still thinking about an unlimited system, just a more comprehensive system to deal with threats including Russia and China. But you could see that the Democratic influence in this language, because the second clause in that policy statement is, it's the policy of the U.S. to rely on nuclear deterrence to address more sophisticated and larger quantity near-peer intercontinental missile threats to the homeland of the United States, right? So you still have this bifurcation, this debate between those that believe that missile defense should be applied to all actors, including peers, and those that want to continue to rely on the threat of nuclear retaliation to deter these threats. So I think we're still going to have this problem going forward. I think we need to be mindful of this, because if the Republicans and Democrats lose the House or the Senate in the next couple of years or 4 years, whatever we have in train now could be derailed. So to the extent that we can build consensus on this going forward, and I think comments that Chris made about Congress recognizing the counter space capabilities of Russia and China, that's key. It's a different level of debate today than it was before. I think Congress recognizes that Russia and China are posing threats to U.S. space capabilities. Russia is actually building nuclear weapons to be deployed in space. It's in that context that they now must consider U.S. space-based interceptors. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can prevail, depending on, again, how the politics line up.
One last thing I would add to that. As I mentioned, I had the single color of money when we were building out the initial missile defense systems and the program element structure that was streamlined. That's another area that Congress can and what I've understood is that there is a bipartisan effort on the Hill to take a look at how do we, not just for missile defense, but how do we do business differently when it comes to defense, especially in lieu of the threats that Rob just talked about with both Russia and China, because doing things the same way and expecting us to produce faster is not going to work.
Okay. Chris, anything to add to that?
No, I very well stated. Agree.
Indeed. Trey, a direct question, a little technical question to you. Do you believe we're able to address the problems in mid-course discrimination?
Well, certainly mid-course discrimination has been something that we have had to deal with since the beginning of missile defense. And I would say, yeah, I believe that there have been advances in that area. I mentioned one aspect of it, and there's several facets of it. One is, first of all, you have to be able to track what you want to kill, and you'd like to be able to track it continuously from a birth to death situation. You would like to have multiple sensors from various angles to be able to do that as well, to understand what's going on. So that's one facet, one aspect of it. The other is, how do we improve the discrimination that's actually on board our kill vehicles with some of the technology that's been developed since the beginning of the missile defense system. And the final piece is, if you can't discriminate, you take everything out. And that's where you start to get, again, multiple, many satellites, many interceptors going from a single interceptor on a GBI to multiple kill vehicles on an NGI, that kind of thing. You start to take more of a shotgun approach than you do a single bullet approach. It still is an issue, but I think that there's some lessons that we can learn if we look at other warfighting areas that I won't go into on this, but I think there's lessons that we can take out of, for example, combat air forces and that type of thing to apply to that problem in space.
If I could add just briefly, this is an example of where boost phase defense plays to our strengths. And that is by attacking missiles as they are rising through the atmosphere, and being able to defeat those systems, shoot those systems down. That's before they release their warheads and associated penetration aids, et cetera. And it makes the problem of missile defense and homeland defense much easier if you can get those systems early in their flight before they release those penetration aids and their warheads as well. So essentially you can take out potentially multiple warheads that would have destroyed multiple military facilities, multiple cities, et cetera. You can get those with a single space-based interceptor if it can do effective boost phase or early mid-course phase before those penetration aids are released, et cetera. Over.
And Steve, the Missile Defense Agency is taken with the need for mid-course discrimination. They, in addition to the HBTSS satellite that gets a lot of publicity and visibility, MDA is also working on a discriminating space sensor to provide the discrimination of warheads from countermeasures. It gets less play, but it's probably as important.
Good points. Well, somewhat related to some of the other discussions we've had, but the MDA and the missile defense architecture is considered to be a good starting point for working through the technology fielding in 2-year cycles. What do you all describe as lessons that were learned in those early years that can be applied today looking forward?
Well, first of all, and I appreciate it. I think that question came from General Palikowski, who's on the call, and she was a great leader at MDA and subsequently in her career. First of all, I believe that we learned, the original construct is that the Missile Defense Agency would be able to put this capability out, and we were also using 2-year type of increments. And it got to the point where we were actually fielding stuff faster than the warfighter could respond. And we actually got out in front, for example, sometimes of the warfighter. And so we learned the lesson that we needed to be better timed with that, and how we did that, and better preparation for that at the front end. On the back end, even though we had established service level boards of directors and that type of thing, the services themselves, because of the innovative and rapid way that we were fielding and acquiring this capability, were not prepared to support those the way they should have been. And that was partly our fault in being able to do that. And so having that handoff between the Missile Defense Agency and the Navy or the Army or the Air Force, as the case may be, and today the Space Force, we can improve that on having more hybrid program offices at the front end, more and better communication between the services and the agency that's responsible for fielding this. That's the one thing. The other lessons that we learned, and actually the positive lessons that we learned, and it's in my career in a broader sense, so many times in the building we get into a death spiral in programs. And what do I mean by that? We have, especially a very tough technological challenge. We will issue a contract. The contractor hires a standing army of engineers. We rush into the program only to find out we have some really hard technical problems that need to be solved. And you have this standing army of engineers waiting on a smaller group to solve those technical issues. And you end up getting into schedule delays and then budget increases, and you get into a death spiral. The way we try to approach that in the beginning is, let's lay out what are the real technical challenges very soberly that we're facing. And then very early in the program, let's define what we used to call, and still do, I think, a knowledge point that we can demonstrate that capability, so that gives us confidence that we can continue, and you can do that with a lot smaller workforce.
Gotcha. Hey, Steve, one of the biggest criticisms of the ground-based mid-course defense system today is that it doesn't work because there was a rush to deployment. right? As I mentioned, we pulled out of the treaty in 2002, and we deployed the first GBI at the end of 2004. But people forget that it was always intended to be an evolutionary approach, and that we would continue to upgrade the system over time. Today, we have the F-35, which is a 5th-generation fighter. I would argue that today we still have the 1st-generation ground-based interceptor. Maybe it's a generation and a half that was originally deployed in 2004. It's been 20 years, right? And the first major upgrade, I think, to the ground-based system will be the next generation interceptor with its multiple kill vehicles, which won't be available until 2028. We have not had the senior leadership focus and the resources necessary to improve that system over time.
Good points. Great industry question coming from Elsa. Thank you, Elsa. Centers around supply chain. What are the potential space industry supply chain constraints that could prove to be challenging to realize the Golden Dome architecture, both near term and long term?
That is an outstanding question, and there is absolutely a bad answer, which means that the supply chain problems that we're facing are much broader than just the missile defense industry. It is broader across the entire defense industry, and in fact, across the entire American industry in some cases. But that does have to do with special materials, rare earths that have to be used, long lead times, and that type of thing, where we have reliance on either offshore or foreign manufacturing in some cases. And so those are going to have to be addressed. And the only way to do that is to focus on those, tee them up in areas one at a time to be able to solve those. Because when I was that director, we were always looking for what I called inverted pyramids in our industrial base, which is we had many programs relying on one particular supplier that we were in danger if something happened to that supplier. We've got that on a much broader scale today, and extends off of our shores.
Thank you. Anybody else?
If I could add just a comment, not specifically on that topic, but one that we've touched upon. People oftentimes ask me, what's the secret sauce that the department needs to adopt in order to get this done? And I'm sure there are more than 5, but I've come up with 5 kind of high-level baskets here. The first is clear presidential guidance and attention. If you want to get anything done at a serious level inside the department and do it quickly, you have to have the president's attention. You have to have clear guidance from him. And we have that today. The president has made clear through the executive order what his intentions are. His strategic intentions are very clear. Folks in the department cannot say, well, I didn't know what you wanted in this instance. No, the president has been very clear. And this is, as we mentioned before, this EO reflects the clearest guidance on any defense program that he's issued since he came into office. The second area is clear organizational lines of authorities and an understanding of roles and missions. You know, who's doing what to whom inside the department. Trey touched on this, and he highlighted the significant authorities that he had as director of the Missile Defense Agency, and used those to very good effect, as he and Rob described in getting the GBI system, GMD system deployed in record time. Third area is ample budget with few strings. Not always easy to get that either within the department or from Capitol Hill, but if this is a priority, folks will provide, Congress and others will provide, comptroller will provide adequate budget to really move out aggressively. Some of that money is going to come to naught in the sense that you may pursue technical approaches or avenues that don't work out, but it's worth spending the money just to learn what's going to work and what won't, especially on a quick timeline. Fourth, Ben, is direct line to the SecDef and DepSecDef to adjudicate disagreements in the department. And shockingly to this group, there are disagreements within the department on all kinds of things. And but knowing, Trey, I'm sure you could give plenty of examples of folks knowing that you had a direct line to the secretary meant that they weren't going to they didn't challenge you as much because they knew you had the secretary's ear. I saw that up close and personal with General Abramson and many other SDI directors as well. And then the last bin I would highlight is accelerated acquisition authorities. If you have to comply with every jot and tittle of the FARs, the FAR is not your friend here. accelerated acquisition authorities are absolutely imperative. Trey, excuse me, what do you think of that that suite of thoughts? What
I
have I
think
left off that group?
that is a very good list, Chris. And in fact, it aligns very closely with my experiences in terms of some of the difficulties I had in the department. You have to realize that the Department of Defense, and this is somewhat by design, but somewhat by evolution, is pretty much risk averse. And they want to make sure that before we field another capability, we want to make sure that it is as good or better than the capability we have out there. And they built a whole series of processes to make sure that whatever comes out of the building is something better than what we have. What they don't do very well is when you have unprecedented capability. You don't have a defense against right now a Russia or China attack. You don't have this capability or that capability where we have no defense or we have no capability in the field. Turning that whole building around and getting it out very, very quickly and then improving it over time is something that they just don't know, they're not used to doing. So it has to be orthogonal to the way they do that. As a result, we ended up with a lot of I shouldn't say a lot of infighting, but there was certainly a lot of friction within the building as we're trying to move along. And having Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary England's backing on that was really, really critical, along with, as I said, the specialized acquisition authorities, the fact that I could go outside the FAR, I could go outside the financial management regulations, that really helped.
Well, I've got a little bit of a softball coming at you. I'll paraphrase a great question that came from David here. This is a really good, excellent discussion that's being had here. It's raised the magnitude of the organizational, budget, managerial problems that need to be solved to make this thing happen. It is early in the game with this new administration, granted, okay, but is there any evidence so far that effective decisions that would enable success are really being discussed seriously now and can be expected? In other words, do we think, what's our confidence factor, and are we going to be able to walk the walk that's being talked right now?
Look, that's a hard one to answer at this point, but let me just suggest that I think the administration, the department is really moving out smartly on this. I mean, the fact that MDA put out a request for information to industry to get we didn't have this when we did the first Trump missile defense review. It was a more of an institutional approach. We relied on MDA. They didn't go out to industry to solve this problem. You've got the Space Force now. You've got SDA. You've got everybody crawling over each other, trying to come up with answers. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. Now, whether we can make the right decisions in the right amount of time, I don't know. But this is a change from what we've done in the past. Even SDI, I remind you, SDI was a big R&D program, right? Essentially, this executive order is a deployment program.
Yeah, great. Other comments?
I would say I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't predict this, but I will say that I have never seen an environment aligning the way this is for this to happen. And so I think that, like I said, I see what's coming out of the White House in terms of direction and guidance and commitment. I see what's happening on the Hill with respect to maybe looking at bipartisan ways to make sure that we can actually do things differently than we have in the past. And I see some of the energy that's been released even so far by MDA and by SDA on RFIs and that kind of thing, beginning to collect information to really begin to move. It remains to be seen whether this can happen in a realistic and in an accelerated fashion. But I will say I'm encouraged by at least what I've seen so far. Now, the downside is that, as Chris mentioned earlier and Rob both, we've got to get the leadership into the building, the permanent leadership. That needs to occur as quick as we can, because that's what's going to really add traction and fuel to the fire to get this going.
Another interesting example, at the beginning of the Trump administration, even while we were conducting the missile defense review, North Korea had let off a nuclear test. President Trump picked up the phone, called Secretary Mattis, and says, "I want you to do something about this." Mattis didn't go to the Undersecretary for Policy. He didn't go to the director of the MDA. He went to the DoD comptroller. And he says, pull together a supplemental funding request to address this. And within a couple months, we had a $4 billion supplemental that included $2 billion for the Missile Defense Agency and $2 billion for sort of left of launch activities. $4 billion plus up for the Homeland Missile Defense Mission. That's your baseline. This administration has to come up with at least $4 billion and probably double that, I think, in FY26 to show a true commitment to this activity.
Which reinforces in turn the internal budget deliberations that are going on and the 8% cut to lower priority programs and activities. How will that money be allocated to higher priority programs and activities, et cetera? I would come back to one thing I mentioned, which is that for a Congress that was functional, having real appropriations bills, real authorization bills. There is an authorization bill signed into law, but real appropriations bills would help enormously with the strategic planning that the department has to do. And yes, supplementals here and there can help tremendously, but the long-term planning is absolutely vital. And knowing what your budget is, I hope you're right, Rob, that a significant increase will go to this mission area. If there isn't a significant increase in this mission area, we will not succeed in delivering the capabilities that the president wants.
Well, we're down at the bottom of the hour, the 90 minutes, an unscripted question. I'll give each of you, you get off the stage, 30 to 60 second pitch. General Obering, your thoughts in closing.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Like I said, I very much appreciate being invited to address the group, the panel, as well as the audience. As I mentioned in my talks, I think that this is critically important for the United States. It's critically important that we defend the United States, not just against limited threats, but full threats like Russia, China, and to do that in both a deterrent way as well as be able to defeat other threats from other countries. The technology is far, far different than what we've had in the past. A lot of the systems we have today, we began fielding in the early 2000s. That technology actually came from the 90s and even as early 80s. And so it's imperative that we now start to invest in the technology that's going to get us to the next generation of missile defenses. And I do think we have the technology. I think we have the resources. And I think now we have the will from the leadership. So I think it's a matter of getting this done.
Thanks, Trey. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, after observing this for 30 plus years, I can't get away from the politics of missile defense. And we just wasted so much time and energy, especially during the Cold War, trying to relitigate definitions of the ABM Treaty, and it was fatiguing. If there is some way going forward that we can avoid this and bring the Democrats on the Hill on board, at least part way, I think we should try to pursue that, because again, whatever we do this year will have to be sustained over at least 5 to 10 years to bear the true fruit. And the only way to do that really is through some sense of compromise. That's it.
Thank you, Rob. Chris Williams.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to Trey and Rob for joining us today. It's always good to see you, and both of you are true national assets. The experience you have in these areas and the fine work you did when you were in government and you've done since leaving government is noteworthy. So thank you for joining us today. I'm reasonably confident. I'm the yin to Rob's yang here, I guess. I'm reasonably confident we have some very good people in government and folks that are coming into the government. If you look around, some of the key folks, General Collins at MDA, you have General Saltzman and Gutlein at the Space Force. You have solid leadership in key other key organizations. You have strong desire of SDA to move fast, other things, and you have an industry that's eager to support. So I think we have a good opportunity to get this done. And why don't we plan to do this again in a few months or a year or so and see where we are at that point. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
I was going to pick up on that very point, Chris. I'd like to echo Chris's thanks to the three of you, actually. What a superb panel we've had on a very complicated topic that, to your point, Rob, is not new. We're refreshing at a different time with a different set of threats that we've had over the years in the past. But 1,000 thanks to the three of you. Another 1,000 thanks to the hundreds of you who have been on this SpaceTime call, which has been pretty fantastic. The topic brings this in, and it's our privilege at NSSA to host forums like this. We invite your feedback on it. There have been a lot of questions about will this be recorded? Yes, this will be recorded. We will have this thing posted on our website sometime in the future. NSSAspace.org is our org chart. I mean our website. And we certainly invite your feedback, not only on this particular topic, but on other future topics you'd like to be hearing from us at NSSA. So with that in mind, on behalf of NSSA and the Moorman Center for Space Studies, we thank you all for joining us. We look forward to continuing these important conversations in the future. Stay safe and everybody have a great day out here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.